Would you like Sir Sajid to be sworn?
Yes, please.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Take a seat.
Welcome back, Sir Sajid. Thank you very much for coming back to help us.
Thank you. It's good to see you in person.
Could you commence your evidence, please, by giving us your full name?
Yet, Sajid Javid.
Thank you very much for attending today and for your provision of a witness statement, a further witness statement for this module dated the 2nd of October 24, running to some 80 pages, as to which you've appended the usual declarations to the truth of its contents. Sir Sajid, you were Economic Secretary to the Treasury from September 12, Financial Secretary to the Treasury from October 13, Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and also Minister for Equality subsequently, and then Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills, latterly Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, and for our purposes, most fundamentally, you were Secretary of State for Health and Social Care from the 26th of June 2021. You were also Chancellor Exchequer and Home Secretary prior to that, but most importantly, you were Mr. Hancock's successor as Secretary of State. The role of Secretary of State, indeed the role of the DHSC, was a very wide one in the context of vaccination and therapeutics, was it not?
Yes, it was.
You've set out in your statement something of the nature of the role. You were concerned with funding for new research, the oversight, although the MHRA reported to the Secretary of State on the question of authority, but the oversight of the approval of vaccines and also therapeutics, the liaison with and the taking advice from the MHRA, the JCVI and other expert bodies. You had to make decisions about the vaccination programme, also about deployment, the effectiveness of the deployment, and the huge subject of delivery. And may we take it, it's obvious, that throughout your time as Health Secretary, that there were meetings on all these subjects, all these matters every day. There were gold meetings, there was hourly meetings, there were emails, texts, iMessages, probably every, day and night.
Yes, you may. And if I may, just on that, you just more generally at the start, if I may, my ladies, just say that I think the vaccine program overall and related therapeutics was a huge success for the country. It saved many lives, saved many people from being ill. Obviously, I recognize that wasn't the case for every single person, and there were some people that were sadly injured, and maybe we get onto that as well. But I just want to place on record my thanks to all those people that were involved, all from the civil servants, the officials, the scientists, all the clinicians, NHS, the clinicians and others, all the volunteers in the vaccine deployment centres, but also the many, almost 1 million people that came forward for trials. Without what they did, we wouldn't have had that success. And I think that's very important to recognise.
The first issue in this context that I want to ask you about is concerns the vaccination of young people.
Yeah.
And we're, as I told you, we're simply going to deal with a handful of discrete issues which are of particular importance in the context of this module, but which arose in the course of the vaccine and therapeutic programs. The position with the vaccination of young people was that technically, formally, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines were authorized for use by the MHRA, in the case of Pfizer for 12 to 15-year-olds in June 2021, and for Moderna, 12 to 17-year-olds in August of 21. And what was the way in which it worked was that you or somebody else would invite the JCVI to give advice on whether or not formal authority having been given for use in supply to the population, it should actually be offered to the population, and in what way? So you had to await for advice from the JCVI.
That's right. So we would, before any decision could be made to offer any vaccine to any group of people, and of course you're asking me about children in this case, the same sort of general safeguards and rules applied. The vaccine first had to be approved by the MHRA as safe and effective. And then the JVCI, the group of independent experts that would look at it in much more detail, and they'd look at both our trials and evidence from abroad and take into account a number of factors. They would consider it and then provide advice to me as the Secretary of State.
And your predecessor, Mr. Hancock, had formally asked for advice from the JCVI.
Yeah.
You took up that post on the 26th of June,
Yeah.
very shortly after your arrival in the department. The JCVI provided interim advice, as it happens, dated the 5th of July. But on the 6th of July, there was a meeting conducted by you. We'll have 000480653, please.
Yep.
We can see from the top third of the page the date, excuse me, and the attendees, including yourself, Permanent Secretary Clara Swinson, from whom we've heard, and a number of officials, including from the office, the Chief Medical Officer, the CMO,
Yep.
JVT, Jonathan Van Dam, that is, and also officials from, or members of the Vaccine Task Force, and your own departmental officials. There is a reference halfway down the page to, yes, thank you very much, to the CMO, so Professor Sir Chris Whitty, saying JCVI are sitting on the fence. They've failed to land on a conclusive view one way or the other, but they will have to advise conclusively on whether they deem the benefits of the vaccine to outweigh the harmful impacts of children catching COVID. And Professor Whitty said that on clinical grounds he would write to the JCVI to ask the committee answer that question. Did you think that there had been any degree of untoward delay in the JCVI responding to your predecessor's request formally for advice as to whether or not for 12 to 17-year-olds vaccination should be offered?
No, I didn't feel that there had been any kind of unnecessary delay. I think that clearly the work of the JCVI for all groups, including, of course, children, is vital, and that it's given the time to consider. And I also, I think I would have thought at the time that in terms of priority, in terms of the population, clearly the adults and older groups were starting with the eldest for lots of reasons, were the most important. That's where the JCVI started. And it eventually, once it's given its views on older groups, it eventually has got to thinking about children. I believe at this time, even there were other countries using vaccines for children. They had authorised it for earlier use than the UK had. So I think the JCVI wanted to also look at that evidence. So I think it took its sort of time, but I would say in a good way.
The JCVI had, of course, in December 2020, produced the prioritisation list.
Yep.
And phase 1 had its 9 cohorts. By this time, is this right, the targets for the offering of vaccines to everybody in that phase 1 priority list had been met. So we were dealing here, or you were dealing here, weren't you, with the decisions about whether to offer vaccines to people against the background that the prioritised people had already been offered, all of them, a vaccine, because that original priority list was for 18-year-olds and above, unless they had particular health issues.
Yeah, that's right. But in considering whether the vaccine should be offered to children, there were other factors that you might not have considered for adults that had to be taken into account.
So it was, in fact, there was a more difficult debate to be had.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily more difficult. It's just there are different elements to the debate, and you wanted to. I would want to be reassured that the JCVI and my own clinical advisors such as the CMO, DCMO, others had considered that before I make a decision as a Secretary of State.
On the individual level, there was the perennial debate about whether or not the benefits outweighed the risks
Yep.
significantly, such as to merit authority,
Yep.
authorization, and then offer.
Yep.
And then with children, were there the additional considerations as to whether or not the vaccination of children would promote good educational practice, would lessen the disruption to their education, and also have a wider beneficial impact in terms of getting children back to school and have their life prospects bettered. So it was a less straightforward issue than perhaps the issues concerning those persons who'd been in the original priority list.
That's the case, but especially I think when it came to the 12 to 15 cohort, when the decision, I believe, was made in September. So it was starting with older groups, so 12 to, I think, 15 to 17 first. I believe that was in
That's
August
right.
in terms of the universal offer. Of course, there were offers to children that either
With
were
risk
living with or with vulnerable people, or in vulnerable households with vulnerable people, or they had other exceptional reasons to take the vaccine earlier. But in terms of a general offer for I remember a lot of discussion around wider issues about potential benefits of offering vaccines to children, particularly in September, and that was around the 12 to 15 cohort. The other thing I would add, my lady, if I may, is that I also remember around that time, sort of through that summer, really, sort of July, August, and then leading on to when the decision around to 12 to 15-year-olds was made in September, the Prime Minister was incredibly keen to start offering vaccines as soon as possible to children. So there was an immense amount of pressure from the Prime Minister directly and therefore from his team at Number 10 to try and speed up the process, to make a decision quicker. The Prime Minister would often say to me, why are other countries, he'd often mention Portugal, Spain, other countries in Europe, Israel, he mentioned a lot, saying they're doing much better job than us, the way he would phrase it, in terms of vaccinating children a lot more quickly. Why are we taking so long? And my answer generally to him was always that we've got a process to follow for a reason, to make sure it meets our standards. And just because other countries are doing it doesn't mean to say we should be doing it. We might get there eventually, but we have a process, MHRA, JCVI, our own advisors, and we must follow that process.
I think it's fair to say that there were a number of people in government, in the office of the Chief Medical Officer, within the Cabinet Office, as well as the Prime Minister himself, who expressed concern about an apparent delay in the summer of 2021 in getting the JCVI's decision advice out of the door. That there have been plenty of references to concern about apparent delay in the paperwork. Would you agree?
There was, and as I say, for the Prime Minister himself and that team around him, there'd be that constant pressure, and sometimes I'd be told, not directly by the Prime Minister, but some of the people around him, oh, Prime Minister's not very happy with you, he doesn't think you're doing a good enough job, you're not taking this seriously enough, why aren't you getting those children vaccinated a lot more quickly, why aren't you getting them jabbed, and all that kind of pressure. And my view was simply really pretty much just to ignore that pressure, because it wasn't my job to have the Prime Minister decide that children should get vaccinated. I had to listen to the evidence and the scientific advice, and that's exactly what I did. Had someone been in my job that was perhaps less experienced in government, I mean, you mentioned you mentioned at the start that I had various different roles in government before I ended up in that position. I think by then I just had sort of learnt how to do a cabinet level job, I guess, more effectively, and to ignore certain pressures and just do what you want to focus on as the right thing to do, and not be led by necessarily always what the Prime Minister of the day wants you to do.
All right. If we look at 408948, this is in fact the minutes of a cabinet meeting on the 20th of July 2021. So in the middle of the first debate about 12 to 16 and 17-year-olds. At page 12, thank you very much, you can see there that somebody was saying, probably the Prime Minister, the United Kingdom had been a world leader in its vaccination programme, but was being overtaken by countries like France, Italy, Canada and the US, who'd all taken the decision to vaccinate those over 12. It was unclear why the JCVI were taking so long to come to a decision. So that's a clear reference, I think, to that which you've described exactly, which is that the Prime Minister was vexed at the speed at which the process was taking.
Yes.
As it happened, that was the 20th of July. On the 3rd of August, you receive advice from the JCVI on vaccinating children aged between 12 and 15 who had underlying health conditions. So it wasn't a universal offer at that stage.
Yep.
You were focusing on those with health conditions, and you agreed almost straight away. On the 4th of August, the issue then arose as to whether or not 16 and 17-year-olds should be offered a universal vaccine, whether they should be offered universally a vaccine, in addition to those who were aged 16 and 17 who were at risk, who were in risk groups. And there was a meeting on the 2nd of September by the JCVI in which they considered 12 to 15-year-olds who were not in a clinical risk group. The JCVI decided that whilst the direct benefits of vaccinating children and young people marginally outweighed the risks, there were wider educational and societal issues which required examination. And they wrote to you, and your department wrote to all the UK CMOs asking for their view. The UK CMOs published their advice on the 13th of September, but the result of bringing the CMOs into that process and seeking their formal advice and then waiting for the advice delayed the process. It took more time. Were you concerned, as the Secretary of State, that the process to address universal vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds had become further slowed down? Was that something of concern to you?
I don't recollect that I was particularly that concerned, just on the basis that, again, that there's in my mind, there was a clear process to be followed of getting expert advice and then basing my decisions on that. And once I'd received the JCVI advice, which was, as you said, that it was, let's say, marginal, but it said there may be wider factors to consider, which really wasn't in their purview. That's why I asked the CMOs for their views, and clearly for them to come to a view, they had to have the full JCVI advice. And I think I remember at the time, I think certainly with the England CMO, Professor Chris Whitty, I think he said he also wanted to talk to Royal Colleges and other consultants and paediatricians and just get wider input, and also speak people in education, I believe, as well. And I think that was the right thing to do. And despite, I think, the CMOs having to speak to a group, I think my recollection is they did it fairly quickly in a speedy manner. They treated it urgently. And so it wasn't a process that really sort of, that lasted days. And eventually when they gave their advice, and which they published in a letter to all MPs and public
Yes.
consumption, I thought it was quite detailed, actually, and very clear, and they set out the case very clearly, which I accepted, and that's why I decided to make an offer of the vaccine. But I think we sort of called it a non-urgent offer. It was a general offer, but and based on the reasoning that we had set out in the CMO letter and the JCVI advice.
And the submission went to you after the UK CMOs had advised.
Yeah.
It's dated the 13th of September, INQ 000401383. If we can just have page 2 up first. Thank you very much. We can see there the date, 13th September 21, private office submissions. It's to the Secretary of State, yourself, and it sets out the issue, which is that the JCVI concluded on the 19th of July that children aged 12 to 15 who are at risk should be offered vaccination, but they didn't consider that the benefits outweigh the risks for healthy 12 to 15-year-olds. And so, having considered that there was a marginal benefit for healthy 12 to 15-year-olds of benefit against risk of vaccination, they wanted the CMOs consulted. Did you have any difficulty with agreeing to that position? Ultimately, of course, it was a matter entirely for the Secretary of State, was it not?
It was, and I didn't have difficulty because of both. I took both pieces of advice together and considered them in that way. The JCVI advice, but also what was very important to me was the advice of the CMOs, and by CMOs I mean all 4 CMOs of all parts of the UK, and they were all 4 were. They were all agreed on the position and the way forward, and then I felt that as Secretary of State that the groups of people, the JCVI, the CMOs, had considered this very carefully. That I felt that their reasoning and their arguments they set out were well balanced, well thought through, and I accepted the advice on that basis.
Arguably, it then got harder, or even harder, because the JCVI were written to by your department in November 21, asking for their formal advice as to whether or not there should be a universal offer to 5 to 11-year-olds, so the younger cohort. The formal authorizations for the use of, in fact, smaller doses of vaccines for 5 to 11-year-olds, and then subsequently 6 months to 4-year-olds, had been granted in December 21 and then respectively December 22. So after around about the time of the first authority, that's to say for use for 5 to 11-year-olds, you'd started the process rolling by which the JCVI would give advice on whether or not they should be offered vaccines. You asked the DHSC to draw up a business case dealing with issues such as the impact on reduced paediatric intensive care admission, educational disruption, and the potential benefit of reducing anxiety in children and loved ones by having them vaccinated, or, by contrast, what level of anxiety might be engendered by offering them a vaccination. Why did you take that additional step of seeking extra advice on those wider ancillary issues?
Because I felt that, so first, as we've just gone through the decision, I felt that when it came to children, the key cohort in my mind were the 12 to 15-year-olds, or 12 to, say, 17 in total. And to go below the age of 12, so 5 to 11 in this case, would require an even stronger argument. Because, for example, with educational disruption, I remember some discussions at the time with the CMO and others, that there was an argument that educational disruption was more disruptive to a sort of 12 to 15-year-old cohort than it would be to younger cohorts. So I thought maybe that argument in itself wasn't strong enough. And so I can't remember the exact discussions that took place, but we had a number of discussions as a group with CMO and there'll be others in the room about what would be the case if we were going to go lower than 12 years. And at the same time, by the way, there was still a huge amount of pressure coming from the Prime Minister at number 10. The Prime Minister just wanted to go as low as he could go, and kept pressuring that we make these decisions much more quickly. Again, I didn't want to succumb to that pressure, and I didn't. And I wanted a proper, thoughtful consideration. And I think that's how, that together with my team, how we came up with the factors that must be looked at.
A submission went to you dated the 10th of February 22. This is again in relation to 5 to 11-year-olds. 000112227. We can see SO, Secretary of State at the top left, Private Secretary, and it comes from an unredacted name, but in fact it was a submission from your department based upon the advice which had then by then been received from the JCVI, and it was, as we can see, to do with vaccination, the offer of vaccination to 5 to 11-year-olds. And we should make plain, shouldn't we, that authorization for the formal use of vaccines for 5 to 11-year-olds had been granted by the MHRA. So the Prime Minister was entitled to say, authorization has been granted, let's get on with it. And we can see the recommendation to accept the JCVI advice, agree the statutory products, agree the proposed timing of publication. And at pages 4 to 5, starting with paragraph 14, we can see there under the heading of benefits and cost effectiveness, vaccinating this cohort is unlikely to provide any significant benefits against the current Omicron wave. And over the page, paragraphs 15 to 17, the point is made for the policy to be cost effective, a future wave of infections would need to come about while vaccine effectiveness in children is still high. And then at 16, an alternative policy would be to postpone a decision to deploy these vaccines until a heightened threat is identified. And so it was altogether a more difficult decision, but the balance is more finely weighed, or was required to be more finely weighed by comparison to the earlier decision for over 12-year-olds. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
In your statement, you say that in relation to the vaccination of 5 to 11-year-olds, you personally were somewhat reluctant, and reluctant is the word you use in your statement, because you believed that it was a measure that perhaps arguably had not yet proven to be necessary, and you were concerned about it. Given your personal view, and you were concerned, as I say, or you had a degree of reluctance about this, why did you agree to accept the advice from the JCVI in relation to the offer of vaccination to this cohort?
So it was the one piece of advice from JCVI where they made a recommendation that I was very reluctant. And I was reluctant because, as you've seen in some of the evidence that has just been shared, and from what I remember at the time, that I thought the decision of the JCVI was very finely balanced, because the references were the Omicron wave, or I think almost all infections by that time were Omicron. Omicron, we knew in a general sense, was a lot more severe. A lot more people had been infected because its rate of infection, so many children would probably have already been infected. And but then the argument of the JCVI and others that supported the offer was that, well, this is where we are with Omicron, but you don't know what's going to be around the corner. The virus could change again, it could mutate, and by then it might be too late to vaccinate this group. So I felt it was very finely balanced. I was also, again, getting a huge amount of pressure from the Prime Minister on this cohort as well. His view was, again, it couldn't happen quickly enough. He was aware of this advice, because it would go to his office would be told that I've received advice and the broad conclusion of that advice. And then I felt when I put that together, it would have been very hard for me to take a decision to ignore the advice of the JCVI and say, look, and say, look, I know what they're saying, but I'm not going to make that decision, because I felt my job clearly is not to do what I personally think is right or wrong for me or my family. It's to do what is right for the country and the population, and I had to base that decision on the expert advice that I had been given.
And the JCVI is, of course, the independent expert, in fact, statutory body, tasked with the obligation of giving advice to ministers as to the correct way forward.
That's right. And also I took some, when I looked at the way the JCVI had phrased even their recommendation, I think they called it a non-urgent offer. And so it wasn't to make the vaccine available to children, obviously for their parents to decide. But as a non-urgent offer, it wasn't something that either myself as the Secretary of State or the department more generally were going to sort of push, I guess, or advertise in the same way as the more important vaccinations early on in the pandemic for adults.
And it's right to say that when the statement was made on the 16th of February that an offer would be made to 5 to 11-year-olds, it was very much couched in terms of this being a non-urgent offer, yes. and that was how the JCVI put it. Was the DHSC directly concerned with the rollout of the offer and the operational side of offering vaccines to 5 to 11-year-olds? There was, as it happens, a policy by which there was, I think, a 12-week wait following COVID infection which had to be allowed to elapse before 5 to 11-year-olds could be offered the vaccine or take the vaccine. Was that a policy which found its genesis in the DHSC, do you know, or was that an NHSE Public Health England issue?
I think in general the recommendations and sort of clinical decisions around sort of the 12-week period and other issues around the gaps between sort of one vaccine and your next vaccine, those were rightly clinical decisions, but I believe in general they either have come from the JCVI itself or from the UKHSA, the UK Health Security Agency, or what was before Public Health England.
All right. VCOD, vaccine is a condition of deployment. I'm aware that you gave evidence in Module 3. I repeat my apology that you've had to come back and give evidence again. When you gave evidence in Module 3, the focus of much of the questioning was about the impact on the care and health sector of the introduction of the initial policy, which was to mandate vaccination as a condition of deployment for care workers in registered care homes, and what was the impact on the sector. But there was a later policy, at least a consultation for a policy, as to whether or not this mandated vaccination policy should be rolled out to the wider care and health sector. And particularly with an eye on the impact on vaccine confidence, or alternatively hesitancy, I want to ask you some questions about the rationale for that second policy, which ultimately wasn't in fact introduced. It was pulled on the 1st of March 2022. So if you could look at a briefing paper, please, 000497213. This is the document, in fact, which provides the most recent public health evidence from the UK Health Security Agency on vaccine effectiveness, because it provided the foundation, or rather the government needed the up-to-date position in terms of public health evidence in order to be able to take a final decision as to whether or not that wider policy should be implemented. And if we look at page 2, and this was a document a briefing paper that went to you, paragraphs 9 and 10, we can see that the preliminary data showed that there was some protection being given against infection through vaccination. Compared to unvaccinated healthcare workers who had not also had a prior infection, those with 2 doses were 32% less likely to be infected with coronavirus. But the estimate was uncertain because the range of possible effectiveness was large and includes evidence of no effect. And then at 10, preliminary evidence from UXA also showed that the effectiveness of all vaccines against symptomatic infection is lower in all periods against Omicron compared to the Delta variant. So was this the position? By January, February 22, as you've rightly said, Omicron was rife, and the emergence and the application or the presence of the Omicron variant had a significant effect on the data as to the effectiveness of the vaccines, and therefore a further subsequent effect or ancillary effect on the efficacy, the effectiveness of a VCOD policy. Was it worth it, bluntly? Is that the position that was reached at the beginning of 2022?
Yes, and the way I would perhaps explain it is that when the original decision was made on VCOD, VCOD, as we refer to it in the department, in 2021, end of 2021, that was at a time when there was no such thing as Omicron. The Omicron variant did not exist. So it was based on the virus at the time. The dominant variant, I believe, was Delta, and there was some Alpha. And those were the facts taken into account. By January 21, and certainly by February 22 and February 22, the almost all infections, I think by that time, were Omicron. In fact, I believe something like by end of January, almost a third of all infections that had ever taken place during the pandemic were Omicron, and that meant that the policy had to be reassessed in light of that evidence, and the facts change. And if the facts change, we change the policy.
Page 5, paragraph 33, please, on this document. In addition, is this correct? There was obviously also significant concern about the impact on the workforce, and this is something that you addressed in Module 3. But we can see there the figures about, firstly, the number of persons in the NHS who weren't already vaccinated, and also further down, and if you can scroll back out, you can see 34, 35, 36, what the possible impact might be of mandatory vaccination in terms of staff leaving the sector. So it wasn't just a question about effectiveness of the vaccines in the face of Omicron. The government obviously had to be aware also of, firstly, whether or not vaccination was required to be imposed mandatorily, given the current uptake, and secondly, what the possible impact would be on the sector if the policy were to be pursued. Is that right?
So can you ask me the question again?
Yes.
What's the question?
Was the government also concerned, not just with putting Omicron into the general picture and seeing whether or not vaccination was required, or at least whether or not mandatory vaccination would lift the uptake of vaccination uptake and protect the workforce, but also whether or not members of the sector, the workforce, would leave their posts rather than agree to be vaccinated?
That wasn't a decisive factor, no.
If we then look at paragraphs 20 and 21, I think on page 3, the submission says the evidence set out above means that the cost-benefit case for the current VCOD policy is more finely balanced than before. It's very likely the effect of VCOD as a means of protecting patients and people with care needs is less than it was, while protection against severe disease and hospitalisation is much higher and takes longer to wane. This is not the purpose of VCOD. So it was a much more finely balanced policy decision than the earlier emanation had been, and ultimately the government didn't pursue it. Is that right?
That's correct.
Were you concerned also about the impact on members of ethnic minority communities, and as well as, of course, the the care and health sector workforce itself in terms of a longer-term impact on vaccine confidence by imposing a mandatory program on healthcare workers? Was there a risk that there would be a wider disbenefit in terms of decreasing confidence in vaccination generally?
It was clearly
A backlash.
I mean, it was clearly one of the risks that we had to consider, and we did, as has been referred to, and I think is evident from that evidence paper. It was a balanced decision. It was a balanced decision to implement the policy in the first place, and it was also a balanced decision to change it when the facts had changed. But in terms of, you referred to ethnic minority workers, and they're, relative to the population, there's a disproportionate number of people actually that work in the NHS that are from ethnic minority backgrounds, and we're incredibly proud of them. I think we're proud of everyone that works in the NHS, whatever their background. But my view was very firmly that everyone, regardless of their ethnicity, they should be treated equally. And the whole purpose of this policy was to reduce the rate or the risk of infection for vulnerable people, patients of the NHS, those in hospital, and that's the purpose. And the virus didn't discriminate about whether it was infecting a black, brown, or white person, and that is why it was clearly we had to follow the same policy for everyone, regardless of their ethnicity, and that was the correct way to do it.
Widening out the debate, to what extent was the DHSC focused on reducing barriers to uptake and increasing confidence in the vaccines generally? Was that part of your core functions?
Just to check, do you mean with respect to VCOD, or do you mean
No, generally more widening it out?
Oh yes, yes. It was I felt it was a very important part of my core responsibilities, but also more widely in the department, including with my junior ministers, and particularly the vaccine minister.
It's obvious that there are a number of parts in the government machine concerned with the issue of reducing barriers to uptake and increasing vaccine confidence.
Yeah.
From the more operational end of things, NHS England, the voluntary charitable and the voluntary and charitable sector, and the military and the volunteers at the operational end, as well as in the heart of government, Cabinet Office, DHSC, OCMO was obviously plainly very concerned about this issue. Which government department do you assess was in the driving seat when it comes to trying to drive through measures to try to reduce barriers to uptake and to increase confidence? Who was driving forward the government machinery on this, in your view?
I think, well, first, I think there was a general shared responsibility, but in terms of the department, I picked two that I think that were really essential to this. One was my own, and we were rightly, I think it's the health department responsible for the delivery of the vaccine, the uptake of the vaccine, and I think both as the Secretary of State, but also all these expert advice, the CMO, the DCMO, and others that worked with the department played a crucial role in building vaccine confidence. But the other department would be the Cabinet Office, because there was I think that's the one department that can coordinate properly across government, and one could see a role virtually in every department where how other ministers, cabinet ministers, and others could play a role. So, for example, you can see there'll be a role in the education department, in the Department for Work and Pensions, in the Home Office, for example, with migrants and others. And so I think the Cabinet Office is the right department to, once a sort of battle plan, a strategy was agreed, to make sure that all of the departments were doing their bit, and that was being checked and improved if it could be improved.
And could you give us, please, some idea of the amount of time that was devoted to this issue, or the priority that was given to it in your department? I mean, were you on a daily basis or a weekly basis trying to focus on what practically could be done at the operational end on reducing barriers to uptake by way of getting the message about vaccination out there,
Yeah.
making the vaccine practically available, operationally available, trying to deal with some of the conspiracies and the myths and the tropes surrounding vaccination. Who was responsible for making sure that that general drive was actually being put into practice? And
Well, I felt
achieving
ultimately it was
results?
my responsibility as the Secretary of State. And it's something that I worked on, I'd say, almost every day. Because every day in my department, so every weekday in the department, we would have, sometime in the morning, a meeting of what was the vaccine to the delivery team. And that included all our colleagues from the NHS, which were primarily responsible for delivery of the vaccines, and also VTF and CMO and others. And I would chair that meeting, and there would be an agenda. And I'd say almost every time we had that meeting, one of the agenda items would be vaccine uptake, especially in combating hesitancy, building vaccine confidence, and also discussions, especially if there had been some incident or something around conspiracy theories and issues of that nature. And we would agree in those calls, there would inevitably sort of be video calls with everyone joining in. We would agree that what would be the following that meeting, what would be the action points, and then the next day, as we'd talk about it again, I would want to make sure that what we'd agreed previously had been done, what were the results, what we were doing. Also, I would hold a number of meetings with groups, especially with, for example, with ethnic minority groups, with media, and that might represent certain communities, as I'm trying to sort of myself do something where I was trying to reach out. And then lastly, I also felt that, not specifically with vaccines, but I felt throughout my time in that role, was that health generally, there were a lot of inequalities, including regarding ethnicity, but also more broadly based on gender, disabilities, and more broadly, and deprivation. And that was an area I did a lot of work in, and I felt that if it was clear that this was something I was and the government was taking perhaps more seriously than before, that would help to build up general confidence in the health system. So, for example, the inquiry, the independent review I asked for from Dame Margaret Whitehead into the inequalities of medical devices and instruments, although that wasn't related, of course, to vaccines, I just felt it would show that there were some real issues around ethnicity, for example, in healthcare, and the government was taking them seriously, and I felt that would help build up confidence.
The material before the inquiry suggests provisionally that whilst there were a great deal many people and bodies and entities concerned with the issue whether or not barriers to access could be reduced, could be further reduced, and confidence increased, that there was a general failure perhaps to utilise or to focus upon greater use of local level means, practical solutions, to make sure that the barriers to access in the way of ethnic minority communities, disabled people, migrant groups, and other marginalised parts of society were, well, whether there was enough use of local methods to try to reduce barriers. And it's obvious that there were a great deal many government departments and people concerned in this issue and in the best of faith doing their best. Is there an argument for having a more focused, specific, identified government body, department, entity that can focus all its attention on ensuring that these important issues are addressed, that vaccine confidence is maintained and practical barriers to access are reduced? It appears to be a very fragmented, disparate picture in terms of the outcome of the work that the government did.
In general, yes, there is. I think that, for me, I think one of the lessons learned should be that even in peacetime, like now, we should be preparing for the next pandemic, of course, and one of those areas of preparation should be vaccine, or even more broadly, therapeutics delivery, because the next pandemic, it might not be vaccines, it might be antivirals, for instance. But whatever that pharmaceutical sort of intervention is, I think there is a strong argument to have a unit, a group of officials, experts that are very focused on that in peacetime. For example, what they could be doing today is actually building that sort of confidence with communities, traveller communities, different ethnic minority communities and others today, because I think to try and it's very hard to build that confidence quickly. It needs to be built slowly over time and around healthcare more generally in peacetime. And that is why I felt the work I was doing in inequalities was so important, which sadly your successive sort of secretaries of state and the current government haven't continued. And that's why I did all the work on what was a draft white paper, which was to look at all these inequalities and issues.
Is that the draft white paper on health inequalities?
That's correct, yeah. Was to try and sort of build more confidence with communities that I felt in some ways perhaps been left behind in healthcare and in consideration of their health needs.
A witness said very pertinently, I think, a couple of days ago, that if you can't see and assess the scope of the problem, you can't fix it. Do you assess that you had sufficient data, sufficient information as the Secretary of State about the extent of the practical barriers to access and the particular unique needs of all these various communities, from Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities through migrants, through ethnic minority communities and so on, so as to be able to formulate proper policies for their resolution and to put operational plans in place? Did you know enough about what it was like on the ground?
I felt that when I was told that the data that I was getting was a significant improvement on what my predecessor had had at the start of the pandemic, and I can understand why, and a lot had been done to improve things even by then. Your question was there enough data points? I mean, I think that could be improved, and that's just, I think, just a sort of, it's easier to say in retrospect, but I think there are areas, for example, in sort of behavioral science, behavioral data that could be used. And there were instances of that where I asked for such an analysis and got it, but it wasn't, I think it could, something like that could be more sort of a fixed part of the process. So, for example, there was an idea, and it was good to look at lots of different ideas, especially what other countries were doing. And I remember someone had said in one of those meetings, I refer to daily meetings, they said, look, I can't remember which country it was in Europe, but they were offering younger people, like teenagers, like in the early 20s, theatre tickets or cinema tickets, some to get vaccinated. It's like an inducement to get vaccinated. And I was skeptical about that. I just felt that if you get a vaccine, it should be for a positive reason to want to protect your health or protect your loved ones from infection rather than some kind of inducement. But I thought it wouldn't be right of me just to ignore it and pretend I know better, because I wasn't an expert on it. So I did ask for a behavioral science work to be done on that and similar ideas. And what we got back was that basically my skepticism was I think proven that it could backfire. So that was useful data, useful analysis, but I think having more of that kind of analysis would be helpful.
So let's be clear about this. In relation to the passive receipt of data as to the reality on the ground, you think more could be done. There are always improvements that can be put into place. But also there is a case for taking more positive steps in terms of accumulating knowledge and seeing whether or not there may be incentives or nudges based on behavioural science that might improve the general lot in terms of availability of vaccination.
Yes.
All right. Prophylactics. When you were Health Secretary between June 21 and July 22, a significant part of your time appears to have been taken up by considering the issue of post-authorization making available of prophylactics, in particular, but therapeutics generally. Shortly after you arrived in the DHSC, on the 12th of July 21, that there was a meeting on the topic of prophylactics, 000497986. And The email is from the Private Secretary to Lord Bethell, who was one of the ministers in the department. I don't think that you had been a attendee at the meeting, but Lord Bethell's Private Secretary had, as well as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Sir Jonathan Van Dam, and a number of other officials. We can see remarks from Sir Jonathan to the effect that COVID will remain prevalent in the population, and that therefore those who are immunocompromised and clinically extremely vulnerable are concerned. And he notes the fact that JCVI will likely prioritise the immunocompromised for booster vaccinations. And over the page, at page 2, JVT says in the second indent, he believes there's a requirement for a clinical lead on the immunocompromised. This person needs to be able to pick up work on shielding, therapeutics, antibodies, and the vaccine agenda. There currently isn't anyone who's able to step into this space, and this is something that needs to be fixed. There needs to be further discussion with ministers, but there is currently a gap. Was this an issue that was brought to your attention?
Yes,
Was it on your agenda?
Yeah. I don't believe I was at this meeting, but
No, you weren't.
yes, generally I would say yes. This issue was about doing as much as we can to make sure when we're thinking about pharmaceutical defences, it's not just vaccines, but it's obviously vaccines is important for certain members of the immunocompromised community, but it doesn't work for everyone. And so we were looking broadly at therapeutics and antibodies and antivirals.
It's obvious that whilst vaccines had been purchased at risk, that is to say, hugely expensive and fundamentally important decisions have been made about whether to procure vaccines had been taken without knowing whether clinically they would be effective or significantly effective. In relation to therapeutics, by contrast, whenever a decision had to be made about whether or not to pursue a particular therapeutic, there had to be an assessment of its cost effectiveness as well as the risk-reward balance. And HMT ultimately had to take a view as to whether or not it would be funded.
Yeah.
Why was the DHSC in that position? Well, why could you not simply pursue a range of therapeutics, in particular prophylactic treatments, on the basis that you could purchase them at risk and then see whether or not they would be clinically effective?
Well, I think a lot of the decision making on that issue about how much funding there was or how that funding would be accessed for sort of pharmaceutical intervention in general, whether that's vaccines, therapeutics, antivirals, etc., they were made before I was in the department. A lot of that had been sort of set in train, as it were, before I joined the Secretary of State in June of 21. From what I saw was that, what I can say, and because it was self-evident, was that by the time I came to the department in June 21, obviously the vaccine, finding a vaccine that worked had been successful. Those vaccines had started to be delivered. There were still a lot more people to vaccinate, but I think that the sort of broadly the focus has more shifted on vaccines and getting them delivered because they were broadly working, albeit of course not for everyone. They weren't appropriate, and I felt that there was less focus, and including from the Treasury, on having something other than vaccines. And that particularly became an issue for me. It was around, I think, quite early on when I became Secretary of State. I think August of 21, where there was an antivirals task force led by Eddie Gray, and he had spoken to my officials and then eventually spoken to me and written to me sort of recommending the purchase of antivirals, 2 antivirals in particular manufactured in the US. and I agreed fully with his arguments and what he'd set out, and the clinical and the medical reasons for that. And not just because I thought they could be perhaps more useful with certain groups of people where vaccines were less useful, but I just thought it would be another line of defense because, especially at that time in August of 21, of course, we didn't know about Omicron at that time, but there was a widespread view that the pandemic wasn't over and COVID was likely to mutate many more times, and we don't know what was going to come down the line or whether the same vaccines were going to work. So I also felt almost like an insurance policy that we should have something else. But his recommendation that he gave me was for over, I think, between the two antivirals, procuring over 2 million units. And I had to have a big battle with the Treasury and with Number 10. And eventually I did secure some, but it was a lot less than I had wanted.
You secured agreement for the purchase on the 19th of December 21 of 1.75 million courses of molnupiravir and I think a further 2.5 million doses of Paxlovid. So that's absolutely right in terms of the outcome. But coming back to the question of risk, in your statement, you say, I saw firsthand the approach to funding the vaccine, and the willingness to take risks did not even last the length of the pandemic. So from that statement, from that observation, you appear to be saying not enough was done, as it was and had been done very successfully with vaccines, to take a punt, to take a risk on the purchase of therapeutics.
Yeah, I felt again, obviously, I wasn't there at the start of the pandemic, but it felt to me the attitude had changed towards funding of pharmaceutical defences by sort of middle of second half of 2021. And just to say something, the reference that you just made to the antivirals that were eventually purchased. In my arguments to get more antivirals, there were actually two distinct phases. There was the pre-Omicron phase, and there was the post-Omicron phase. And in pre-Omicron, I had a huge amount of resistance from Treasury, from even the Number 10 team, parts of the Number 10 team. And in that case, I did manage to secure, but it was a lot less than I wanted. And I think it was collect about 700,000 units. When Omicron was a reality, then I'd asked for fresh advice about antivirals and about what role they could play right on the onset of Omicron, right at the start in November. And I had fresh advice from Eddie Gray that I asked the CMO and even the CSA, the CSO, the Chief Scientific Advisor, to comment on. And they all said that we should get more antivirals. There was a very strong, I thought, advice from all three of them, and they were my very important advisors to me. And that is when I asked for funding for a lot more antivirals in light of Omicron, because especially at that time when I got that advice, we weren't even sure if the vaccines were going to work with a booster effectively against the Omicron, and I felt that we had to go and secure whatever we could because there was a global competition for these antivirals. There were only two manufacturers in the world. They were US, meaning the US would get the first supplies, whatever it wanted, and then all other countries had to fight for what was left, and I felt that we had to get orders in and quickly. And if it turned out that we couldn't get what we wanted after we ordered it, that's not something in our control, but I felt we had to do whatever was possible and was in our control.
In September of 2021, as you say, there was what was described, in fact, by you as quite frustrating debate about whether or not the recommendations to buy antivirals would be accepted by the Treasury. And it's clear from your evidence and other evidence that the Treasury, in particular in the form of the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Barclay, was concerned about how efficacious antivirals were and told his officials that they had to be extremely clear about whether or not the funding was justified and to be rigorous in their approach. We can see some emails between Sir Patrick Vallance, Eddie Gray, who was the head of the antiviral task force, and Sir John Bell of Oxford, 399-326, concerning antivirals. And on the first page of 399-326, we can see Eddie Gray, the head of the antiviral task force, writing to Sir John Bell and Sir Patrick Vallance and saying this: we've at least stopped the DHSC trying to negotiate itself down under pressure from the Treasury. SOS has been impressive, that's you, of course, is running with our proposal and telling officials that if any compromises are to be made, he'll make them with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, not officials. Now, in hindsight, do you think that there is a better way of trying to get approval for therapeutics in the teeth of a pandemic than having to negotiate in each case through the iron fist of the Treasury?
I'm not sure there is, because the Treasury is the only department that has money in government, and you're not going to be able to buy anything without the money. And so ultimately the Treasury has to agree in one way or another. I think where things can improve is that I felt the Treasury officials, this is more about the officials rather than the Chancellor himself at the time, they were trying to sort of argue with my officials, who were clinicians and scientists and experts and on vaccines and therapeutics. They were trying to argue with them about where on the science of the antivirals and whether they're effective or not. And I don't feel that was their place. I mean, they, by all means, they can say, look, they might be effective, but we're not going to fund them because of some other reason. That's their prerogative. But I felt the arguments were that there were arguments between officials, and that's why in this note I think it refers to. I didn't want my officials agreeing that any kind of sort of backing down on the requests with Treasury officials. I felt that if whatever agreement was ultimately going to be reached, it has to be done by me and the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, so that both of my colleagues, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, could see just how important this was and how important I thought it was to pandemic defences.
And if we scroll back out, I think we'll see a reference to the difficulty of getting decisions across the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. Perhaps it's on the second page. Yes, at the top, in the top email, an email from Eddie Gray to Sir John Bell. As of now, that's the response from the government, is most frustrating. We've ordered a small amount of PF, but late and at a level that will get no priority. So that's the point you make about being in the priority lane from the standpoint of manufacturers. MCK, that's a manufacturer, have given us a deadline of Friday. We're in danger of falling in the same trap. Very annoying. Secretary of State has supported our recommendations, which is good, but getting decision across him, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, ridiculously hard. In relation to vaccines, Sir Sajid, there was a ministerial panel which brought together, forced to sit at the same table, Treasury, BEIS, DHSC, and I'll be reminded, there was one other minister there, I can't now remember. Cabinet Office, thank you. In which, in the course of which meetings, decisions to fund over the level of £150 million were taken then and there, rather than having to make a case, a business case, although business cases were made for each vaccine and each expenditure, one after the other, to get final ultimate approval from the Treasury. Why was consideration not given to have a similar ministerial panel in relation to therapeutics, which might have reduced the level of difficulty which appears to have been encountered in getting decisions made and authorised?
I think actually, if there was, it wouldn't have made much difference, because the key decision is not to have a sort of ministerial panel. I mean, that's helpful in the process of making a final decision to buy something or not buy something. The key decision is to allocate a budget, and so that the ministerial panel that has just been referred to on vaccines, that was established once the Treasury had already decided there's a budget. In the case of vaccines, again, that decision was made before I was there, but it was almost unlimited budget. Like, go after vaccine candidates, and it's going to cost what it's going to cost. And as a panel, you just sort of make the final decision, but there's a budget, there's an overall budget that you've already got control of. And so there's a budget delegated to that panel. But if there was a panel on antivirals, but there's no budget above it, then it makes no difference.
So the problem with therapeutics, including antivirals, was that there was no overarching budget.
There was no
in the
budget.
same way that there'd been a £5 billion budget for vaccines. There was no overarching budget to which appeal could be had and recourse could be had.
There is no budget, and you might recall in a previous evidence session we talked about the spending review for the NHS. I believe it's in module 1. I can't be sure, but where around prior to this moment that we're you're considering now in sort of September, November 21, in the summer of 21. I had to agree the overall spending envelope for my department for the next 3 years, and that included vis-a-vis the budget. It included sort of a budget cover for, as it's referred to, budget cover by the Treasury for vaccines and other sort of responses by the NHS to the pandemic in terms of more staff and more diagnostics and so forth. At that time, I was specifically asking for a budget for antivirals, and that was unsuccessful. And the decision that was made eventually was that you're not going to get a budget for antivirals. Should the nature of the pandemic change, should there be a new variant, and you need antivirals, then you'll have to come back and revisit it. And I knew at the time that will delay things at best. At worst, it will mean there will be a real lack of funding when it was needed.
And so when it came to seeking Treasury approval for expenditure in relation to specific therapeutics, was there then an additional block in the flow of money, which is that you were told on occasion, or perhaps regularly, if you want funding for this particular therapeutic, you're going to have to make a cut elsewhere in your health budget? All right.
Yes.
And in relation particularly to Evusheld, about which we've had a great deal, you received a submission on the 20th of June 22, this is later, so post-Omicron, 000497090, in which ministers were asked to agree that the department shouldn't deploy Evusheld in a prophylactic programme at that time, and that Evusheld should be considered through the technology appraisal process run by NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. And briefly, in relation to Evusheld, was all the advice that you received from OCMO, from your department, from officials, pointing in one direction, which is that given the background of Omicron, given the background of the success of the vaccination programme, and given the state of clinical evidence as to the effectiveness of Evusheld, it wasn't something that could be pursued at that time. It had to go through a further technology appraisal process.
Yes, essentially, yes. So Evusheld, I believe, was the sort of the research and development of Evusheld had begun towards the start of the pandemic.
Yes.
But it didn't receive MHRA, so it took a lot longer than vaccines, and it didn't get MHRA approval until March of 22. By March of 22, almost every infection was Omicron, so the nature of the virus had changed dramatically, and my understanding was that all sort of testing or trials that had been done of Evusheld to date had been with the Delta and Alpha virus and variant, and not with Omicron. And I received very clear advice. I think first it was in May of that year, 22, that there's not enough evidence at that point that Evusheld is going to work. I think the trials were held by a group called Rapid C19, and their advice was that there's not enough evidence that it's effective against Omicron, and more trials are required, and that's what was more testing was done. And then in June of 22, I had very clear advice from CMO and others that they believe that Evusheld is not effective enough against Omicron, and therefore it would not be a value for money to purchase it.
Following that decision being made, there was a meeting with AstraZeneca on the 4th of July 22. AstraZeneca was the manufacturer for Evusheld. And no doubt quite a difficult meeting. You were at the meeting and you explained why the decision had been taken not to procure Evusheld. Evusheld, AstraZeneca expressed obvious and understandable concern as to why they thought they were being forced through a different process. Their product, Evusheld, was being put through a further clinical technological appraisal trial rather than being authorised, being agreed to be used and procured. Following that meeting, I think you resigned, or fairly shortly thereafter you resigned, and then you sent a message to your successor, Steve Barclay, who'd been Chief Secretary of the Treasury but became Secretary of State. And in a WhatsApp message with him dated the 13th of August, you said that, just a quick on Evusheld, I wanted to make sure you know that the week before I left, I agreed a deal with AstraZeneca that would have allowed us to generally roll out the drug to vulnerable people, but we'd only pay if it turned out to work against current subvariants as defined by us, i.e. no success, no fee. We wanted to know, please, whether or not you had actually agreed a formal or commercial deal with AstraZeneca, because the meeting with the AstraZeneca on the 4th of July very clearly indicates that, of course, they were very unhappy that there was no deal and Evusheld was not going to be pursued.
Yeah, so in that meeting, as you say, I wanted to be very open and with AstraZeneca, because I felt that, well, I think it was just the right professional approach in that AstraZeneca, I think, first of all, throughout the COVID pandemic, as a company, had put a lot of time and effort in developing vaccines and other therapeutics around the pandemic. They had invested a lot in Evusheld, so I felt that it deserved a full explanation of the government's decision. And I explained that the advice was that it was not effective against Omicron. AstraZeneca's view was that the advice was wrong and that it is effective against Omicron, broadly put. And they said that they could prove that if it was used more widely, the government would see. And that is when then I raised this idea with them, said, well, okay, if you're so convinced, then why don't we test it and have this kind of sort of generally put no success, no fee arrangement. And the two gentlemen from AstraZeneca were very positive about having such an arrangement. They did say it wasn't something that you could sort of just shake a hand on there and then and do it. It was they had to go away and think about it, see how it could be done, speak to their superiors. But it was left in a sort of positive position where there might be a deal to be done on that basis. But then, as you refer to, I think within a week or a few days after that, I left that role, and then Steve Barclay, as you mentioned, took over, and maybe I shouldn't have because it's no longer my role. But I was just keen that he knew or knew of the nature of the discussion I had, because I thought it was very important, and that he should know because there might be a deal to be done.
I think I'm not sure about superiors not being there because the meeting was attended by Mr. Pangalos, who was the head of AstraZeneca. But is this the sum of it? You agreed a way forward with AstraZeneca or an understanding as to how you might proceed, but there was certainly no commercial deal or formal contract.
That's correct, yeah.
All right. Two final questions, please. Whilst you were Secretary of State, you received a number of submissions concerning the operation of the vaccine damage payment scheme. And you were given a number of options as to whether or not the scheme could be reformed, and if so, whether or not the flat rate of £120,000 could be increased and backdated for those persons to whom payments had already been made. You received a submission on the 22nd of March 2022 and again on the 27th of May 22. And actually, I think there was a third briefing in June 22. Do you happen to know whether or not there were any changes made to the scheme? You had indicated your strong preference for one of the options, which was an increase in payment, the flat rate, and backdating. But your officials told you it would cost between 1.2 million and 8.9 million pounds. Do you know whether or not your recommendation was taken up or whether there were any changes made generally?
My understanding is that no changes have since that time been made, even now. And I felt that the VDPS is something that my department had inherited from, I think, the Department for Work and Pensions, and I was happy to take it on because I felt that it wasn't fit for purpose and it needed a lot of focus on it. And in the paper, I think you just referred to, is that there were a number of recommendations that were made, and one of the key ones was as you said, the amount of compensation, which hadn't been changed for years. But also, I felt it was too slow, it's bureaucratic. The people working there weren't sort of expert enough, and also what was called the disability threshold was too high. and if I excuse me. And if I may say that even when I left the department soon after, I was, and then I had a meeting with my successor as well about it, because I was contacted by one of my constituents, so I was with my sort of MP hat on, which was the wife of a constituent. My constituent's name was John Cross. And I think his experience is really important here, just to understand how dysfunctional this scheme is, in that he was a retired pharmacist. He got vaccinated in January 21.
I'm afraid I don't want to go into the details of any individual case, and I'm not sure that he would necessarily want us or you to describe his case in public. Is it fair to say, and I suspect this is where you're heading, you did form the view that this scheme required fundamental reform? You may even have been of the view that it wasn't fit for purpose.
Yes, that was my view. And with regards to the case, I won't go through the case, but if it's possible, I think the inquiry should look at this particular case, and I'll be happy to furnish the details.
I'm sorry, we can't look at individual cases.
Okay.
It's outside our scope.
It is also one of the issues that was raised by a contributor to the impact film. So I'm very conscious of it, and I can see in the public gallery there are those who are acutely distressed.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, my lady.
And I should make absolutely plain that we are asking a number of other witnesses about the nature, the scheme, and the susceptibility for reform in relation to the vaccine damage payment scheme.
Yeah.
Finally, Valneva, the contract for manufacture of vaccines in Scotland. The paperwork appears to indicate that advice was given on the cancellation of the Valneva contract on the 9th of September 2021. You were the Secretary of State for Health at that time, but the advice from, it transpired, the vaccine task force was, it concerned whether or not the merits of that contract should be pursued and whether or not the deal should continue. Was the decision to cancel the contract taken by the DHSC, or was it taken by the Treasury in the form of the Chief Secretary?
Ultimately, it was taken by the DHSC.
And did the DHSC take advice from the Treasury as to whether or not the contract should proceed?
No, I think it would have been, I think it was a very clear decision. And so therefore, I think that we would have told the Treasury of the decision, and the Treasury was very happy with the decision. And it's very important, the decision was based on one absolute key factor, in that I received a very clear advice in September of 21 that the vaccine, the Valneva vaccine, was ineffective as a third dose, and that's what we were looking for at that time, which was the real need was for a third sort of so-called booster dose, that it was ineffective and that it was no better than the study placebo. And on that basis, it would not have been good value for money for the Treasury or the government to purchase something that it was never going to use.
And if we have 514013 up finally, please. 000514013, 9th September, did you receive advice from the Director of Strategy, VTF, so the Vaccine Task Force, recommending you issue something contractual to Violet? Violet was the code name for this contract.
Yeah.
Against our expectation of their failure to meet the current delivery schedule based on legal advice, inform the company of our decision and issue notices after Friday, and write to the ministerial panel. And if we scroll back out, we can see over the page a great deal of data about, or a great deal of information about the commercial nature of the contract, but also the clinical effectiveness of the vaccines that they were seeking to produce.
So what's the question?
The question is, was it the VTF who made the submission to the department concerning the termination of the contract?
The main submission came from the VTF, that's correct.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Keith. A few more questions, but we're definitely complete by 25 to 12. Mr. Wagner.
Thank you. Good morning, Sir Sajid. I'm over here.
Good morning.
I act on behalf of clinically vulnerable families who look after the interests of the clinically vulnerable, the clinically extremely vulnerable, and the immunosuppressed. I've just got one area to ask you about. It's vaccination of 12 to 15-year-old children. You asked quite a lot of questions about it by Mr. Keith at the beginning. So the JCVI has said that vaccination should, on balance, benefit the person, in this case the child, receiving vaccination. That is, it would not be acceptable to advise that a child be vaccinated where the benefit was primarily to another individual, including an adult, who can be directly protected themselves, for example, by receiving the vaccination. I think you agreed this morning already that is it fair to say that once the decision reaches government, the other factors can be taken into account, for example, the importance of education?
That's right.
Yeah. Would you also agree that another relevant factor would be the benefit, if there was one, in reducing transmission of COVID-19?
In certain cases, yes.
Yeah. And following from that, what about the potential benefit to clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable people who are close contacts of children, whether that's other children or adults living in the same household? Would that be something that could, in theory, be taken into account?
Yes, and I believe the JCVI did do that.
Did you do that?
Yes, because my job was to respond to the JCVI advice. And so, for example, in August of 2021, I believe that it was around the same, maybe it was the same piece of advice that they gave me around 16 and 17-year-olds in their first dose. They also addressed the issue of those over the age of 12 that had household contacts that were clinically extremely vulnerable.
Yeah. So it's an important factor
Yes.
in those decisions.
Yes.
Yeah. And then finally, the JCVI statement of the 4th of August 2021 records reports of long COVID in children by that time. So that's a year and a half, I guess, into the pandemic, and those reports are coming through.
Yeah.
What consideration, if any, was given to that risk in the decision-making around the vaccination of children?
Well, it would have been for the JCVI and the other clinical advisors that the government had, such as the CMO and others. But just as with the adult population, the risk of long COVID or other sort of concerns would have been taken into account, and it would have been a balanced decision.
Yeah, but do you recall yourself taking it into account as part of your
Yes.
decision-making? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Ms. Morris. Ms. Morris is over there. So sorry, if you could make sure your voice carries on into the microphone.
Yes.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Javid, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID Adverse Reaction and Bereave groups. These groups represent those who've suffered injury or bereavement following their voluntary acceptance of the COVID-19 vaccines. My lady, to assist you, Mr. Javid mentioned Mr. Cross, and you noticed some concern.
I did realise it was his daughter who was...
Yes, and you'll recall, my lady, that Mr. Cross's story was featured in the Impact film at the opening of Module 4, and his daughter Liz sits in the public gallery.
The reason I didn't acknowledge it publicly was I wasn't sure whether his daughter and the rest of his family were happy for me to name him.
I'm grateful, and I've clarified that. Thank you. Mr. Javid, my questions are about the yellow card scheme, a matter of some importance to those I represent, as you'll understand. You said in your statement that when you were Secretary of State for Health that the yellow card system was something that didn't come to your attention and therefore you couldn't answer the inquiry's questions about whether it's effective and you couldn't make any observations about the scheme and how it could be improved. My question is then, how then was the government effectively monitoring adverse reactions if the Health Secretary yourself, the individual responsible for overseeing the nation's health, was unaware of the primary tool designed for this purpose?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very reasonable question, of course. And what I would say is that, so I wasn't aware of the yellow card sort of scheme, which I understand is a scheme that's been there for many years in terms of if there is someone suspects an adverse effect, they can report it, especially to the MHRA, and make sure obviously it's taken account of. But I think just because a Secretary of State is not aware of a particular sort of a system or process within the wider department, whether it's in the NHS or to do with the MHRA or the various other multiple bodies that fall under the department, doesn't mean to say it's not taken seriously or it's not happening. You'll know, obviously, the department itself is the biggest department in government by spending. It's, if you take the NHS, there's well over 1.4 million employees and things. So there's so many different processes and procedures, especially clinical procedures, but especially independent procedures. And I think on those, they would only tend to come to the attention of the Secretary of State if there was a problem or an issue or something had to change or be addressed. And in this particular case, as I understand it, the yellow cards, I believe that's for the MHRA, and I think that because the very important independence of the MHRA, I think that's another reason why generally the Secretary wouldn't interfere unless there was a good reason to. Understood.
But you said in answer to questions to Mr. Keith that you were having meetings about vaccine delivery every day. You're the central role responsible for driving the vaccine project forward. Would you agree that not knowing about the yellow card system, one of the centrepiece systems for adverse effect reporting, highlights a significant gap in the systems designed to ensure that key decision makers like yourself were informed about critical mechanisms for monitoring vaccine safety during the rollout?
I think that, with respect, what I'd say is that I'm not sure me not knowing what the yellow card system is or was would have made any difference because I'm not aware, unless certainly it hasn't been brought to my attention at this point, that there was a problem with the system. There was an issue with the system, and so. And I would suspect the reason it wasn't brought to my attention in those meetings that you just referred to was because no one within my department or the wider department thought it was an issue that was important enough to bring to the Secretary of State. Now, is it possible that it could have been there's a mistake for someone? They should have brought it to my attention because there was a problem. That I'm not saying that isn't the case. So I just don't know enough of the detail. But the fact it wasn't brought to my attention or an issue isn't brought to my attention in of itself is not a problem, because not everything can land at the Secretary of State's desk, because it's just the department is just too vast, especially if it's dealing with a pandemic as well as normal healthcare at the same time and social care, to have everything landing at the Secretary of State's desk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Morris. Thank you very much indeed, Sir Sergeant. I appreciate you didn't realise Mr. Cross's daughter was in the room, and I know you didn't intend to cause her any distress, but that is one of the reasons why we don't go into individual circumstances. But anyway,
that's right. And just to say, I did ask Christine Cross in advance if I could raise the case, and she was very happy for me to do so. I understand.
Well done you for taking that precaution. But thank you very much indeed for your help. I'm sorry I wasn't here last time in person. But I'm really grateful to you for all that you've done to help the inquiry and for your evidence today.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I shall return at 10 to.
My lady, the next witness is Professor Shen, please.
swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
I hope you're warned that there might be a delay before we got to you, Professor.
That's fine, thank you.
Could you commence your evidence, please, by giving us your full name?
Lim Wei Shen.
I hope I don't embarrass you, Professor, by observing that we've had plenty of nights in the course of giving evidence in this inquiry. I think the collective noun for nights is a rout of nights. But anyway, there's been a rout. It's right to point out that you were appointed an honorary Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire, and therefore you are an honorary knight, entitled to use the post-nominal letters KBE, but not to call yourself Sir Wei Shen Lim.
That's correct.
I think that's important given the recognition to the JCVI and yourself, as well as many of your colleagues. You have provided, and we're very grateful to you, 2 witness statements, 471988 and 474527, dated March and October 24. They both contain the usual declarations that they are true to the best of your knowledge and belief. Professor, you were, I think, one of the founder members of NerveTag, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And you sat on the main committee for until 2023, and you were also, and you may still be a member of, you were a member of the National Institute for Health and Care Research.
So I do research that is funded by NIHR, as you say. In particular, I guess for this, in relevance, it's the recovery trial and dexamethasone. That was research that was funded by NIHR. In fact, before the COVID pandemic, it was funded for an influenza pandemic, and I was chief investigator for that.
You were the chief investigator. Would you just keep your voice up, Professor? It's very important that we can hear what you have to say, and your evidence is being recorded remotely through a stenographer. For our purposes, the most important feature of your distinguished professional career is that you have been a long-standing member of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. And in April 2020, is this right, the chair of the JCVI, Professor Andrew Pollard, who's at the Department of Paediatrics at Oxford, recused himself because he'd been involved in the development of the Oxford adenoviral vaccine. And because he recused himself, you became the de facto chair from the 6th of May 2020. Is that right?
That is correct.
And that is why, of course, you are the witness on behalf of the JCVI today. The JCVI was originally an advisory board for polio immunisation. I think it took on its current emanation as a statutory body under the NHS Act 1977. Is that right?
That's correct.
And under that statutory framework, it is an independent departmental expert committee, as well as being a statutory body.
That is
that
correct,
right?
Yes.
The significance of its statutory genesis is that insofar as England is concerned, in certain circumstances where, for example, you have opined on the cost effectiveness of a vaccine, the government must accept your recommendation. But in other circumstances where you've not opined on cost effectiveness, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care is expected to follow your advice or place considerable reliance on it and would need a compelling reason not to accept it. Is that fair?
That is fair, and that's reflected in the language that is used. So in JCVI terms, if we offer a recommendation to the Secretary of State, then that reflects a cost-effectiveness evaluation, whereas if we offer advice, then it is the latter, as you describe.
In relation to Wales, is there a similar position in place, which is that the JCVI is regarded as a departmental expert committee which gives advice to Welsh ministers, and then, as with the Secretary of State for Health, the Welsh minister or ministers are then accountable to their own parliamentary assembly?
That's correct.
Scotland, there's no statutory basis for the provision of advice by the JCVI. It's up to Scottish ministers whether they accept or reject your recommendation.
That's right.
And is the position the same in Northern Ireland?
The same for Northern Ireland and Scotland, yes.
All right.
And I would like to stress that JCVI is independent, completely independent to all of the organisations it's offering its advice to.
Indeed. And my next question was going to be, is it functionally and operationally independent?
Yes, correct.
It seems there were 3 committees set up within JCVI to deal with COVID. There was the COVID-19 committee, there was a COVID-19 subcommittee, and a vaccine monitoring working group committee. Is that right?
That's right.
And to what extent are the terms of reference of the JCVI agreed to by all the health departments in each of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom? And to what extent does the remit of the JCVI extend over the whole of the United Kingdom?
As far as I'm aware, the terms of reference apply across all 4 nations, but with the caveats that you describe about standing committees as regards England and Wales versus Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Were UK health departments, that's to say the health departments in each of the 4 nations, all made aware of JCVI advice? And were they closely concerned with and connected to the operations, the dealings of the JCVI?
Yes, they are. And there are co-opted members from each of the devolved administrations who are at JCVI meetings, as well as added observers from devolved administrations.
And does that go for the JCVI in total, as well as the committee, the subcommittees of which you've spoken?
It applies to the JCVI COVID committee and the JCVI COVID subcommittee. The monitoring committee was actually for information rather than for any decision making. So perhaps less observers attended those.
And did all the nations, United Kingdom, therefore through their health departments, receive committee papers, all the documents, and, as you say, attend relevant meetings?
Indeed, yes.
Could we please have the code of practice? Is there a code of practice applicable? Is there a code of practice which applies to the JCVI?
Yes, there is.
It is, please, INQ 000145984. And if we could just have, please, page 12. All members of the committee and its subcommittees must demonstrate high standards of conduct. We can see in paragraph 35 a reference to the Nolan principles. Do they apply to the JCVI?
Yes, indeed.
And over the page, we can see references to the need for the chair, yourself, to provide effective leadership.
That's correct.
And then at 38, conflicts of interest. Is there a complex and rigorous structure by which conflicts of interest or perceived conflicts of interest are managed within the JCVI?
Yes, these are detailed in the code of practice, and at the start of every meeting, all members are required to declare any potential conflicts of interest. I should also add that with every of our published statements, we also publish the conflicts of interest at the end of each of the statements.
So when we see some of the JCVI papers in a moment, do we see that at the beginning of every meeting, there's a very long list of perceived issues or nominal conflicts, but in truth they're not, because if they were, they would disentitle the person from attending, listed at the beginning of every meeting. And then at the end of every paper, there are again equally long lists or references of possible nominal connections.
Correct.
All right. And in your statement, if we could have 471988 at page 6, please. Paragraph 22, industry representatives are not invited to meetings and may not present to the main committee. Is that right?
That is correct. And perhaps I can add that, it says here that the reason for constituting a subcommittee is to allow industry to present to the subcommittee.
So members or representatives from industry may attend and may be expected or indeed ordered to attend a subcommittee to give an account of themselves and to present data and information, but they are self-evidently not there as a member of the committee.
Correct.
All right. And on paragraph 26 on the following page, do we see that there is also a register of relevant interests reviewed and maintained, which contains everything that could possibly be relevant? And at paragraph 27, is this right? The members and subcommittee members must declare personal pecuniary interests, personal family interests, and then over the page, non-personal pecuniary interests, and then finally personal non-pecuniary interests.
That is right.
All right. So it's a very extensive obligation, is it not?
Yes.
The JCVI first met on the 7th of May 2020 to discuss its provisional advice on prioritisation. And we're not going to go into the details of it, but there were numerous papers prepared on prioritisation. The subcommittee met in September on the 24th. And then I think there were a number of meetings, a very considerable number of meetings between May 2020 and, of course, the end of the pandemic, June 22. Give us some idea, please, Professor, of the number of times the main committee met in that 2-year period.
The main committee and the subcommittee for COVID-19, I think we met 98 times during the period in question.
And the subcommittee?
Sorry, those were the two combined.
That was the combined figure for the main committee and the subcommittee?
Yes.
All right. And did you provide substantive advice or recommendations, depending how you phrase it, to the Secretary of State on 28 occasions?
Yes, that's right. And these are all published clinical statements that are available publicly.
And did the Secretary of State, first in the form of Matt Hancock and then second in the form of Sir Sajid Javid, agree?
They agreed to the advice. I should say it's obviously for JCVI to provide advice to the Secretary of State and not to make a decision. It's for ministers to make a decision.
The ministers ultimately have the call. It's their call. They decide. But as you've already described, they are expected to follow, or at least to follow, if they don't follow, to give good reason, your recommendations, which is why it's couched in terms of recommendation or advice. But they agreed on every single occasion.
Yes.
At the start of this process, why was the JCVI asked to consider and to give provisional advice on prioritisation, in truth, some months before the vaccines were even authorised, let alone rolled out?
As you can imagine, we were going to embark on what would be the largest mass vaccination program in the UK. And that would take a lot of effort to organize, to help the public understand, and a lot of information for advisory groups like JCVI to get through. So it was important, we felt, that we provided interim advice as far ahead of time as possible to allow all these processes to take place.
And there was a lot to consider, was there not, from the likely scientific rationale for any particular prioritisation programme, issues about deliverability, public acceptability, fairness, the equity of having a prioritisation programme, all of which had to be considered even before you knew whether or not they'd work.
Indeed. So all that information had to be learnt, as it were, by the committee, because we were dealing with a new pathogen a new disease, and we didn't know what was necessary in store for us.
But the substance of what you were doing did not differ, did it, from what you had always done historically, which is provide advice on how to make offers of vaccination and how they should be taken up, as you might have done or did do with polio or something like that?
That's correct.
All right. The JCVI is not involved, though, is it, with procurement, delivery, the operational rollout, NHSE, Public Health England, Public Health Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland work, let alone damage payment schemes or vaccine donations to other countries? It's not within your reach.
It's not within our remit, correct.
All right. The evidence before the inquiry shows very clearly that you were lighted upon, no doubt after a great deal of consideration, a relatively simple, straightforward, at least on paper, straightforward, but in practice, of course, very much more difficult, but a relatively simple, straightforward prioritisation programme that focused on the clinical vulnerability of recipients. So obviously, the elderly, the very elderly, then the elderly, then the less elderly, because they were the most vulnerable, followed by the less vulnerable. And a system which simultaneously focused on maintaining the health and care structures around the most vulnerable. Why, in brief, did you come across, or why did you determine that that was the right way to proceed, by contrast, perhaps, to targeting economically active people and saying, well, we're going to vaccinate by occupation or societal role?
So if I give me a few moments to explain this. There are two main concepts when using a vaccine in a pandemic situation where there is constrained vaccine supply. And the two main concepts are either to target those people directly with a protective vaccine and protect those people, or to use the indirect benefits of a vaccine by targeting people who might be responsible for transmission of disease and therefore indirectly protecting those most at risk themselves. Obviously, I say these things as though they are two completely separate. There is overlap, but those are the two main principles. If we want to adopt an indirect protection model, i.e. vaccinating, say, younger adults who are the main people responsible for transmission of infection, then there are two prerequisites for such a model to work well. The first is you need a vaccine that will effectively block transmission, hopefully. And secondly, one needs a high degree of vaccine uptake within that population in order to achieve the indirect benefit. Whereas on the counter side, if you were to use the direct effect of the vaccine, then you would choose the most at-risk population and directly protect those.
And in the summer of 2020, as you were deciding upon which strategically was the right way forward, did you have a clear understanding as to whether or not the vaccines would reduce transmission, or the degree to which they would reduce transmission?
We didn't.
But you knew, because you'd seen the impact of COVID, that COVID killed in far greater numbers the most elderly.
Correct, yes.
So they were the ones who, on an individual basis, required the greatest attention, along with the people who look after them.
Yes.
And is that the nub of why you developed the prioritization scheme that you did?
That is one aspect. I do want to stress the importance of a limited or constrained vaccine supply.
What is the relevance of that?
So if you have only a limited number of vaccines, then using direct protection means every vaccine that is given, every dose that is given will offer protection to a vulnerable person. Whereas if we try and use the vaccine for its indirect benefits, then as an example, you would be vaccinating a 30-year-old who would have less individual benefit, and until you vaccinated enough 30-year-olds to block transmission, you would not be protecting the most vulnerable.
So there were two problems there. One is you couldn't have had, and you wouldn't have for some time a clear understanding, assuming that there was an effective vaccine at all, of the nature of the supply. How limited would it be? How difficult would it be to get it into the population? And you also wouldn't have a clear understanding as to how quickly the vaccination of less vulnerable people would reduce levels of transmission in society as a whole.
Yes, and there's a third element to that, if I may. Usually, the uptake of vaccination is influenced by how vulnerable somebody feels. And if one were to offer vaccination to a 30-year-old who felt that they were personally not so vulnerable, the uptake may be lower in that population. So that was also an uncertainty.
When you began to design the prioritization list, the phase 1 list of cohorts, did you have regard to a great deal of data concerning efficacy, transmission, and the possible impacts of any future vaccine that might be authorized?
Not until the clinical trials reported results. We didn't
When did they start reporting the results?
towards the latter part of 2020, so very close to when the first vaccines were approved by MHRA.
So presumably a great deal of work had to be done in December 2020 when you realized that there were vaccines coming. You had the data, the safety data and the effectiveness data in determining whether or not the course that you had begun to develop in May was the right one.
Indeed.
And did you also, to what extent did you consider, as you drew up the scheme, equity? That is to say, inbuilt pre-existing health inequalities, the barriers to access which are embedded in society which prevent particular groups from receiving healthcare and in particular vaccines, and the need to ensure that their needs were promoted as far as could be in terms of vaccination?
Yes, these were considered in September and November of 2020 as part of the overall strategy. And I should say at this point that equity is promoted if there is a simple to deliver message, because that enables understanding across a wide range of society. And that understanding then promotes confidence and therefore vaccine uptake. Advice alone does not save any lives. The advice has to be disseminated, listened to, and somebody has to agree to go and be vaccinated before any lives are saved.
May it be put another way, Professor, if you put into place a system for prioritization and for delivery of vaccines and you reduce transmission, death, and disease across the whole population, you will protect inevitably even those persons in front of whom barriers to access have been placed or for what a variety of reasons have not been able to take up a vaccine.
Correct.
That's the nub of it. All right. Could we then look, please, at the final emanation of your hard work, which was the priority list, INQ 000354469, dated the 30th of December 2020. There it is. I want very briefly just to pick up some of the most significant features of it, please, Professor. Page 3. There's a reference there to what the committee had regard to, and you make plain you've reviewed published and unpublished safety data from the manufacturers, both in relation to Pfizer, BioNTech, and AstraZeneca. It was Pfizer which had been authorized on the 2nd December and AstraZeneca at the end of December, and those are the two, therefore, that you focus on. Is that right?
That's right.
At the bottom of the page, there is a reference to the 2-dose schedule, and over the page, the JCVI places a high priority on promoting rapid high levels of vaccine uptake amongst vulnerable persons. given the data indicating high efficacy, the committee advises the delivery of the first dose to as many eligible individuals as possible should be initially prioritised over delivery of a second vaccine dose. Is this the first dose prioritisation issue?
That's right.
And in relation to that, had there been within JCVI debate over the previous 2 to 3 weeks or 2 weeks over whether or not, notwithstanding that the formal MHRA authorization for Pfizer-BioNTech provided for a minimum of 3 weeks by way of a gap between the first and second dose, of the issue of whether or not in practice the interval could be extended so as to get as many first doses into people's arms as possible?
We discussed the possibility of using a one-dose schedule even before we issued the advice on the 3rd of December. It is part of JCVI's role and responsibility to decide how best to use the limited supplies of vaccine we had. And one of those roles is to examine whether the dose schedule that is prescribed by the manufacturer may indeed be the optimal dose schedule in the first place. And so from the very start, we were not only looking at the dose schedule that the manufacturers were testing in the clinical trials, but we're also looking to see if we could do even better. Could one dose be as effective? Could a separation in a dose be as effective? So these are other strategies that, as a scientific body with huge amounts of expertise, we were able to examine and wanted to examine even before December.
But the formal authority from the MHRA allowed at least 3 weeks and said no more. Because you are concerned with efficacy, with priority, with practical delivery, you said in relation to Pfizer, the vaccine may be given between 3 to 12 weeks after the first dose, and in relation to AstraZeneca, 4 to 12.
Correct.
Page 5, there's a reference to the direct protection against transmission reduction issue. Well, what was that?
These are the two strategies I described just 2 minutes ago about direct protection versus indirect protection, i.e. Transmission.
So you were considering that you were just simply summarising there the debate.
Yes.
Then we can see, if we scroll rapidly over the next 3 or 4 pages, particular cohorts: age, old. If we go not too quickly, I'm so sorry. If we go back to page 5, age, and then over to 6, older adults resident in care homes, health and social care workers, clinically extremely vulnerable, women who are pregnant, women who are breastfeeding, children less than 16 years, persons with underlying health conditions, and then mitigating inequalities. So in this report, in the published advice, were you there setting out your general approach to each of those potential cohorts?
That's right.
And on mitigating inequalities, page 11, were you at pains to say that you had considered the particular needs of those persons who suffer under inequalities, health inclusion groups, ethnic minority communities, and, as we'll see, homeless, those in detention, and migrants, migrant groups? And in this advice, do you therefore seek to set out why you've gone for the age clinical vulnerability approach?
Yes, I think perhaps one way to understand it is the advice is given here about mitigating inequalities, firstly because we had examined that issue in close detail, and secondly, as an instruction almost to deployment teams, that it was very important to take note of these inequalities and to do our best to mitigate against these inequalities by having tailored measures to deliver the vaccination program.
So this wasn't just an explanation of your position, it was a call to deployment groups to say, you've absolutely got to be on top of this.
Correct.
All right. And then the list is on page 13. It'll be very familiar. Phase 1, there were 2 phases, weren't there? But this was phase 1, residents in a care home, 80, 75, 70 in clinically extremely vulnerable, 65, anybody 16 to 64 with underlying health conditions, then 60, then 55, then 50. And that's where the line was drawn. I now want to ask you some questions about some particular groups of people, starting with children and young persons. In relation to children and young persons, there is a much more difficult balance to be drawn on an individual level, is there not, as to whether or not the benefit of vaccination, which must take into account whether they're likely to get COVID or to suffer seriously from it if they do, against the risks of vaccination, which may, in some circumstances, be increased vis younger people in relation to mRNA vaccines.
Yes, and if I can elaborate on that. The list that you just showed, phase 1, there is a line at the bottom of that that says that we expect phase 1 to include people who were responsible for 99% of the mortality from COVID-19. Children and young people, we're talking, I think, here about healthy children and young people, not children and young people with underlying health conditions, have a much, much lower risk of serious illness from COVID-19. And just to put some figures to that, the number needed to vaccinate to prevent one person from dying in cohort 1 was calculated by the Institute of Actuaries as 20. In other words, if we vaccinated 20 people who are residents in an old age care home, we would protect one life. The same number needed to vaccinate to prevent one person from dying in a 65-year-old cohort was 1,000, and the number needed to vaccinate to prevent save one life in the 50-plus cohort is 8,000. So by the time we get to children and young people who have no underlying health conditions, then the number needed to vaccinate to prevent one adverse outcome, clinical outcome, not safety outcome, is in the many tens of thousands.
Because the prospect or the risk of serious disease requiring hospitalization or, God forbid, death in a child or young person is very much less than in an elderly person.
Correct.
Right.
And it is that benefit that needs to be weighed against the potential harm that might arise from vaccination itself.
And then at the same time, on the reverse side of the coin, there is the issue of risk from vaccination. And was there a concern, which we'll look at in a moment, about the potential, in very rare cases indeed, of myocarditis and pericarditis in children and young persons?
Correct.
Right. How many, or roughly, how many people in the population of the United Kingdom does that 99% of the most vulnerable people amount to?
That's a good question. I don't know offhand. It's
Roughly. It's to be measured in the tens of millions.
Yes.
So your prioritization scheme was deliberately designed to sweep up and protect 99% of those persons who are most at risk of morbidity or mortality, serious illness or death in the whole population.
That's right.
And that was tens of millions of people.
Yes.
And does it follow that as a result of that prioritization approach, sweeping up and protecting the most vulnerable, the rollout of the vaccines did directly avert hundreds of thousands of deaths?
That's right, yes. And I should add, because this may be helpful, timing is also important. By the time we had vaccines that were approved by MHRA for use in 12 to 15-year-olds, we're talking June 2021, by that time, phase 1 of the vaccination program had already run. So the most vulnerable people in the population had already been offered not just 1 dose of vaccine, but 2 doses of vaccines by this time. So they were already highly protected from serious illness.
Children and young persons. On the 4th of June 2021, authority was given by the MHRA, authorization was given by the MHRA to Pfizer to allow the use of its vaccine in 12 to 15-year-olds. So the decision then had to be made by the JCVI, what advice to be given as to whether or not people are actually offered a vaccine if they're 12 to 15. You were asked by the DHSC to give advice on the possible extension of the vaccination programme to 12 to 15-year-olds. And you issued a statement on the 15th of July, 2021, INQ 000387481. Statement on COVID-19 vaccination of children and young persons aged 12 to 17. And what you decided, I think, is that 16 and 17-year-olds who had risk conditions, who were vulnerable, should be offered vaccination. But you deferred the issue of whether there should be a universal call to all 16 and 17-year-olds, and you deferred the issue of whether or not 12 to 15-year-olds should be offered vaccination either universally or to those with a risk condition. I think that's right.
I want to add something to that. So
Please.
At the start of the vaccine program in December 2020, our advice was that 12-year-olds and above who had certain severe neuro disabilities in a residential setting should be offered vaccination, even in phase 1, even though they were children and the vaccine was not necessarily approved for them at that time. We as JCVI said there should be off-label use for this highly vulnerable group because we noted from the evidence that there were a concentrated number of serious illnesses happening in this group. And I just want to raise that we are very aware of the risk to children and wanting to protect them, such that we were willing to offer off-label advice even in December 2020.
So let's be absolutely clear about that. Although the MHRA had given authorization formally only for use, I think, for 18-year-olds and above for AstraZeneca and 17-year-olds and above for Pfizer, it is permissible for the JCVI to state in terms, on clinical advice and after speaking to your doctor, particular cohorts who are vulnerable may receive a vaccine off-label that is out with the terms of the authorization.
Correct.
That's the position.
That's the
and that's
position.
what you did.
And that is what we did. And that is something that JCVI has done in the past with other vaccines as well. So this is something that the expert committee is, if you will, used to doing if we have to do it, and we think it's in the best interest of the public.
There is very clear evidence that there was a great deal of political pressure being applied to speed up the process of giving advice about children and young persons, both now and later, as we'll see when it came to what to do about 5 to 11-year-olds. Do you consider that you gave this advice on the 15th of July as reasonably as quick as possible, or as reasonably as soon as possible?
We were pre-warned as to the likely time when MHRA would give approval for vaccinations, or for the vaccines for 12 to 15-year-olds. And we were asked by the Department of Health to give advice by the end of June 2020. We missed that by a couple of days because we actually gave the advice up to Secretary of State on the 2nd of July. That was when our meeting was held and our advice was formulated. The advice was published on the 19th of July, I believe, because of the internal discussions after we had submitted our advice to Secretary of State.
And indeed, the paperwork shows there was a meeting on the 6th of July attended by the Secretary of State in which your advice was considered. So that publication date, which is the document that we have, actually post-dates JCVI's actual decision on 16 and 17-year-olds.
Correct.
I think you said by the end of June 2020. I think you meant 21.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
On the 4th of August 2021, JCVI announced that 16 and 17-year-olds should be offered a first dose of Pfizer universally, so not just those in high-risk groups, particularly high-risk groups who had been able to have a vaccine off-label, and nor was it concerned with 16 and 17-year-olds in high-risk or risk groups who had already received the nod from the JCVI. There was an extraordinary meeting of the JCVI on the 2nd of September 2021. Let's have, please, 000-354-535. And it was concerned with the issue, page 2, of what to do about 12 to 15-year-olds who were not therefore in a clinical risk group. Is that right?
Correct.
And we can see there the heading at paragraph 2, 12 to 15-year-olds in a clinical risk group. If we then go forward to, if we look further down the page, we can see a reference, can't we, to the issue of myocarditis in paragraph 8 and 9, in fact, 7, 8 and 9, 6 to 9, because by this stage in September, data and reports had already started to emerge, particularly from abroad, about the very rare but nevertheless significant occurrence of myocarditis following vaccination, without expressing a view as to whether or not it was coincidental, caused by COVID, possibly caused by a vaccine, or certainly caused by a vaccine. You were aware of the issue. And so was this issue of myocarditis highly relevant to your determination on the balance, risk-benefit balance, to be drawn for 12 to 15-year-olds?
Indeed, it was very relevant. You may recall, the public may recall, that the US, Canada, and Israel started their childhood or their 12 to 15-year-old program just before the UK, because the vaccine was regulated and approved in those countries earlier. And when they started delivering the vaccines in large numbers to younger people, they noticed this signal of myocarditis, particularly from Israel. And we had many discussions and meetings with our colleagues overseas to understand from them what was happening with myocarditis at that time. This is obviously new for them as well, and they were sharing with us hot information, as it were. And some of their cardiologists were saying that whilst myocarditis appeared to be short-lived, they didn't know the full extent of the potential medium or long-term effects of myocarditis. And so some cardiologists were advising children who had developed myocarditis and had recovered after a few days not to, for example, do any strenuous physical exercise for up to 6 months because of the risk that it might trigger something that is cardiac related. So these were important, very important safety concerns where the picture was only just emerging. And you will understand, because the benefit to children from the vaccine, direct benefit, is small, as we've discussed, any safety concern in that situation would need to be taken highly, highly seriously.
And the position concerning myocarditis was uncertain. You had data, but you didn't know to what extent it would develop as a condition following vaccination, and you didn't, of course, have an accurate idea as to how likely, but it is a very rare condition nevertheless, but what the percentages were.
Yes.
And so in that risk-benefit analysis, as you said earlier, between the marginal benefits of vaccination against the very rare but not to be ignored risk of myocarditis, was it a more difficult balance to draw?
It was a very difficult balance, a hugely fine balance, quite unlike the balance of an older person who might have an adverse effect from vaccination.
Did you also consider in the balance health inequalities, long COVID, the impact on mental health of children and young persons of being vaccinated or not being vaccinated, as well as the ethics?
Correct. We consider all those things.
And if we look at page 4, paragraph 25, we can see a nod to in the discussion to all the main issues which you looked at. Thank you very much. There may be wider societal or educational benefits in vaccinating children. It will allow them to go back to school. For those who live in deprived conditions, that's of additional importance. It may have a wider societal benefit because it will allow the day-to-day running of life and society in the United Kingdom to continue as normal. But were those wider potential benefits and disbenefits at a population level matters for you, or did you only consider, and did you only allow yourself to consider, the risk-benefit on an individual level?
In usual practice, JCVI considers the health benefits and would not consider wider societal benefits or economic benefits. And that is in usual practice. During the pandemic, that remained the case, and I had communications with DHSC to explain that the educational benefits that might arise from a vaccination program were an area that was not in our usual remit and would be difficult to integrate with the way that we balance risk and benefits. That is not to say that we did not take into account qualitatively what the impact would be. We had meetings with Department for Education to try and understand exactly what the impact would be of missing school. One other aspect that I want to stress is that a lot of the absenteeism from school was not due to the infection itself, but due to the social distancing regulations or rules or advice put around being infected. As an example, we already know that most children potentially who were infected with COVID-19 develop no symptoms or hardly any symptoms. And in the usual run of things, those children would go to school because they physically are able to. Children who might be symptomatically infected are again mildly symptomatically infected and may miss a few days of school, but not an extended number of days of school. And if we then ask, what can the vaccine provide in terms of preventing absenteeism from those episodes of symptomatic illness, then it's a much more limited number of absenteeism from school than it is as imposed because of infection control or social distancing measures.
Why then did you refer the matter to the United Kingdom Chief Medical Officers for advice on the wider educational and public health benefits if quantitatively it was something that you could have regard to?
I think, well, quantitatively we couldn't have regard to. We asked Department for Education specifically if they could tell us what does it mean for a child or a pupil to miss 5 days of school. And they couldn't tell us because it would depend which year grade they were in, it would depend on which time of year, whether they were coming up to exams, a whole host of reasons whereby 5 days missed of school would mean different things educationally to different people at different times. That makes it very difficult to put quantitative measurements into any model to decide what does this mean.
And so a good idea was to go to the UK CMOs and ask them to give a paper on the wider educational and societal benefits, which you could then feed into the mix.
Correct. And I just want to maybe just clarify what we did. We offer advice directly to Secretary of State, and in that advice, we suggested to the Secretary of State that the Secretary of State, before he or she makes a decision on policy, may want to also take advice from the CMOs. And there are two key reasons for asking the CMOs. The first is they have a wider responsibility for health, including educational health, as well as the fact that the CMOs are much more closely in touch and have greater responsibility for the infection control measures and social distancing measures in schools, which were the main reason, we think, why children did not attend so many days in school. So they were more relevant for that aspect. And just as an analogy, perhaps for most of the vaccine program, we were asking Secretary of State to take note of JCVI's advice, and on the pillar of JCVI's advice, make a decision. On this one occasion, we suggested to the Secretary of State that he might want to take advice using two pillars of advice, one from JCVI and from the CMOs, because of the educational importance to children. So we were not passing the decision on to the CMOs, and I think that's an important point to make. Neither will we trying to exclude or deny the importance of educational impacts. We're trying to say to Secretary of State, these are both important, but we have to act within our remit, which is health, and that is one pillar, but one pillar only to this decision.
Well, we've heard, of course, from Professor Chris Whitty, and he describes how, exactly as you've put it, they give their advice on the wider educational basis on the premise that at an individual level, the benefit marginally outweighs the risk, as the JCVI had determined, and they give their views. Do you think that that seeking of the views of the UK CMOs and digging further into the issue of wider educational and societal benefit, or public health benefit, impermissibly delayed or unacceptably delayed the process by which the JCVI came to an ultimate view? There is, before the inquiry, numerous references to political and administrative pressure to speed up the process. There are a number of interlocutors who refer to concerns about delay on the part of JCVI around this time.
I think it would be incorrect to characterize the advice we gave and the timing of our advice as delay. We gave advice in July, and we gave further advice in August, and this is all within the context of trying to understand in greater detail what was the risk to children from myocarditis. And you will imagine that in a vaccination program that's progressing at high speed in other countries, they would be gathering information on myocarditis every week, if not every month.
And you've got to have access to all that.
Correct. And that is time. There's nothing that you can do except wait until the information comes.
And at the same time, were children and young persons most at risk from COVID?
No, indeed.
Right. Pregnant and breastfeeding women. At the beginning of December 20, when you were drawing up the final iteration of the prioritisation list, the position before the JCVI was that there was no data as to the safety of the vaccines in pregnancy, because pregnant women and breastfeeding women had deliberately not been included in the trials. Is that right?
That's right.
And you nevertheless sought information and as much data as you could possibly gather, in part by asking for expert bodies, including the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, to come and present to you the JCVI. Is that right?
That's right.
And you looked for data from abroad
Yes.
to see whether that could provide information upon which you could reach a view. But the advice which you gave on the 30th December couldn't positively extol the virtues of vaccination for pregnant women and breastfeeding women because you didn't have an underlying data-driven foundation sufficient to make a positive recommendation. Is that a fair summary?
That is fair. I should also add the context that vaccine confidence among this particular group, women who are pregnant, as reflected in vaccine uptake rates in the usual vaccination program, is lower than in other groups. And so we were particularly concerned to pay attention to their needs and their wishes, which is to understand the safety of these vaccines.
Obviously, adult pregnant women remained at risk from COVID. And so when you gave what might be thought to be equivocal advice, which is that pregnant women should discuss the risks and benefits of vaccination with clinicians, do you think, and I emphasize in hindsight, that left pregnant women and their clinicians in rather a difficult position? Because they didn't have a positive recommendation to rely upon. There was no data which would have helped them resolve in an individual case whether they should be vaccinated. And that gave rise to a considerable degree of doubt, concern, and difficulty.
I agree. If we knew then what we know now, that the vaccines are indeed very safe for women who are pregnant, then we could have been more positive in our advice. But we were reflecting what the evidence was at the time.
In March, on the 16th, there was another extraordinary meeting, one of the many hundreds, or one of the many that you had, and the issue of vaccination for pregnant women was redebated, was it not?
Yes.
And the committee agreed that there should be a universal offer to all pregnant women of vaccines, of vaccination. By that stage, by the 16th of March, had more data been made available?
Yes.
And in essence, what did it consist of?
These were post-approval, post-rollout data. You've heard yesterday about phase 4 studies. So these were phase 4 studies, data from particularly the US, where they had already vaccinated at least 90,000 women who were pregnant and found no safety concerns. So this was positive information on safety.
As a matter of interest, that extraordinary meeting was on the 16th of March. I don't believe that the statement, the position of the JCVI was made public until the 16th of April. Do you happen to know why there was that elapse of time of a month?
I don't know offhand. I can go and find out.
All right. If you don't know off the top of your head, don't worry. Therefore, the position remained at the end of April that, or the position was at the end of April that pregnant women were offered the vaccine, but they were still encouraged to discuss the risk and benefits of vaccination with their individual clinicians. Why was it deemed necessary to add that caveat? It's not a caveat, of course, that is applied in relation to other cohorts who received prioritised access under the scheme.
I think this is an acknowledgement of the confidence and the safety concerns that pregnant women express regarding vaccination. And we are relying also on evidence that is not from clinical trials. We're relying on evidence that are phase 4 studies about the safety of these vaccines. So
they weren't randomized controlled trials, they were observational studies.
correct, yes.
Right. And do you, as a result of this issue, which was obviously extremely difficult for the JCVI, do you, in one of your recommendations, reflect that pregnancy must be a key issue for consideration in any future pandemic? It is vital to ensure that relevant and significant data is developed as early as possible to avoid precisely what, of course, occurred in relation to COVID.
Exactly.
Disabled people were obviously the focus of prioritisation, were they not?
Yes.
In two regards, individuals with Down syndrome fell within priority group 4, and there was an issue about the extent to which those with learning disabilities should fall within priority group 6. Did the JCVI appreciate that, particularly in relation to those with learning disabilities in group 6, whether or not an individual disabled person would know that they were entitled to receive the vaccine would depend to a huge extent as to whether or not the state regarded them as being within the terminological description in cohort 6?
I think you're referring here to how somebody might know that they should go to be vaccinated. And you're right. There was, and it may still be the case, less than full identification of who is living with a learning disability, which makes both analyzing the data and understanding who really is at risk or not at risk, and who's taking up a vaccine or not taking up a vaccine. That makes it difficult. It also makes it difficult to call up the correct people for a vaccination program. I should point out that in a mass vaccination program, the main means of asking people to attend for vaccination should not be self-identification. It should be a patient being asked by some system to go and be vaccinated, because the question of self-knowledge of medical categories of illness does not apply simply to people living with learning disabilities.
But that all rests on the premise that there is a coherent and effective system for recording learning disabilities, for example, or that the NHS or GPs have medical codes in their records which accurately reflect related conditions such as cerebral palsy, which is a medical code. It gets a medical code in the system. You were aware that the systems for recording objectively that the medical condition or the disability sadly encountered by people in this cohort did not work terribly well, which is why you actually wrote to the DHSC yourself, making or attempting to make recommendations as to how the system would navigate its way around this data-driven issue.
Correct. Yes.
And did you assess that enough was done to try to bring together, for example, learning disability registers across the United Kingdom, medical codes in 4 different NHS boards for cerebral palsy, for example, together so that everybody would know reasonably whether or not they were entitled to vaccines?
Yes, I should point out that delivery of the program, as we said, is not within the remit or responsibility of JCVI, but we wanted to understand how well deployment teams were doing. In regard to the specifics of how people were being identified, there were 2 means at least that were being used centrally. One is to use the GP codes for diagnostic conditions that would map onto somebody who might be living with a learning disability. And those codes are published. They are publicly available. I think there are over 443 different codes that are being used to identify people, as well as using anybody, the GP learning disability registrar, as well, I should add, asking local teams to also identify people as best as possible. And I guess what I'm trying to emphasize, although it's not JCVI's responsibility, is that deployment teams were trying to do their best to identify as many people as possible that will come under JCVI's advice for prioritization with as many means as possible. And where we know that there are gaps in the data, then the help of non-centralized bodies such as charity groups, self-help groups, word of mouth, all of these are important as well, because what we want is as many people who can benefit to benefit.
In relation to unpaid carers, at the beginning of December 2020, when you drew up the draft prioritisation list, there wasn't, I think, a reference to sole or primary carers in the draft list. There was a footnote or a reference to the clinician's green book. By the end of December, there was an express footnote in the list which referred to main carer or sole or primary carer. I can't recall which was it, Professor.
I think in end of December it was
test.
main carer.
Main carer.
Right.
Yes. There was a considerable difficulty, was there not, in defining what was meant by sole or primary carer or main carer. Was that something that the JCVI was able to get on top of, or was that a matter which had to be left to the operational experts who were delivering the vaccines?
That was the precise definition is mainly left to the UKHSA and deployment teams, because the precise actionable definitions need to be something that deployment teams can use to call people up.
There was in the list, for the reasons that you've described, no reference to any particular occupation other than care home workers in the top priority, and to wider care and health workers in a lower priority. But there was also no reference to particularly socially excluded groups, such as homeless people, sex workers, vulnerable migrants, the Gypsy, Roma, and traveller communities, detained people, or people who have come through the wrong end of the justice system. It was obvious to the JCVI that those groups were likely to have poorer health outcomes, to be more subject to the intersectionality of deprivation, poor housing, stigma, discrimination, and so on. And the committee was asked to give its views on homeless groups, and it didn't put them into the group, but it did say operationally you might want to think about them in being cohort 6 and on the ground make a universal offer. Why didn't the JCVI take that sort of similar approach, or that sort of approach, to those other marginalised or inequitably treated groups?
In the paper from Public Health England, as it was at that time, inclusion health groups include a wide range, as you've just described. The most information was available for people living with homelessness. And that's thanks to excellent work done in London by some colleagues from UCL. So we had understanding of people living with homelessness, and importantly, there were already efforts in influenza vaccination to reach out to people living with homelessness and to understand their underlying health problems and their willingness to be vaccinated. In that same paper that describes inclusion health groups, I think it might be in the last paragraph, the advice from PHE and the equity group was very clear that outreach to different communities may sometimes be counterproductive if it's not done in the correct way and without engagement of trusted organizations. The reason why there was less information from some of the other inclusion health groups is precisely because there had been less engagement previously, and so we get less data. The paper actually very much put forward that outreach teams, when they go out to offer vaccination to people living with homelessness, whether they could have a formal piece of advice from JCVI to exercise the operational flexibility that we had already described in December 2020. So this was not an addition or any change. We were not making a decision to suddenly move people living with homelessness as a priority group. We were simply saying, yes, please exercise the operational flexibility that we had already described for this group of people, because if you are reaching out to them, and we know that in flu vaccination campaigns, they would respond positively, then please do so. This was a formal piece of advice from JCVI on that front. For the other groups, we mentioned in the advice that there should be concerted efforts to keep on trying to engage with them in order to bring them into the system and be vaccinated.
All right, thank you very much. Lady, I have 5 more minutes to go, and there's 10 minutes of real tens.
Right, Professor, would it help you if we carried and finished your evidence before lunch?
That would be most helpful, thank you.
Right, carry on, please. I may be able to get relieve Miss Beattie of her asking the question by asking it shortly in a minute. Let's
TTS.
See whether you think I have.
We've heard evidence from Dame June Rain and from Mr. Hancock concerning the TTS issue, which arose, of course, between late February, early March of 2021 and the beginning of April, when there was a press conference given on the 7th of April, attended by yourself, Sir Jonathan Van Dam, Dame June Rain. And in the course of those few weeks, it's obvious that there were a significant number of JCVI meetings of the MHRA, the CHM, OCMO, and DHSE. And in essence, what was being tackled was whether or not the emerging data of TTS required either authority to be withdrawn or altered at the hands of the MHRA, or the JCVI to give advice as to whether or not AstraZeneca should be offered to a particular age group, or perhaps to specify by age precisely who should receive, or who, more pertinently, who should not receive an AstraZeneca vaccine. What we're concerned about is the passage of time again. The first reports of potential, and it's extremely rare, I emphasize, but potential adverse effect of TTS first emerged at the end of February, abroad, in fact. Data was received immediately from AstraZeneca and from observational studies and epidemiological studies as to the risks. But notwithstanding the number of meetings, it wasn't until just before the bank holiday weekend, on the 1st of April, that a decision appeared to have been taken as to what should be done. The MHRA took a view and told clinicians and public primary care network directors of the position, but it wasn't until after the bank holiday weekend there was a press conference and a public statement and so on. Why did it take so long, from the vantage point of persons who were younger and might therefore be at greater risk of TTS, for a decision to be reached?
It's a complex decision, as you have already discussed with many other witnesses. At that time, we in the UK were using AstraZeneca vaccine alongside the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in our vaccination program by age. And at the end of February in England, I believe we were just calling up people who are aged 64 years and above, so still very much at high risk. The amount of AstraZeneca vaccine being used at that time was about 50% of the program. Some people have alluded to other countries where the AstraZeneca product was stopped or withdrawn from their vaccine program very early on without clear data. We were in a difficult position because the AstraZeneca vaccine was such a large part of our vaccine program, and at that time we were offering vaccination to some of the most vulnerable people in our population. And so on the one hand, we have to balance the risk of withdrawing one vaccine product, possibly our main product, from the program without sufficient data or support from MHRA that this indeed was a vaccine-related problem.
Can I interrupt you there to say that is all justification for the ultimate position on authorization reached by the MHRA on advice for vaccination given by the JCVI. Why did that, and you've said it's a complex process, why did that decision-making process on your part, the JCVI, have to take from the 25th of February to the 7th of April?
We were asking MHRA for their viewpoint regarding safety and who was at risk and who was not at risk. We had early reports that the clusters of people where TTS was occurring was in younger people. And at that point, as I say, our vaccine program was delivering the vaccine to older people, not younger people. So the people at risk were not yet being offered the vaccine. I should also add that at that point, we were delivering vaccine doses at about 1 million or more per week. If we had delayed rollout of the vaccine by, just say, 2 weeks, that will be 2 million doses not given to people who are aged 64
Professor,
and above.
forgive me. Again, that all goes to the merit, of which there is a very strong case, of the ultimate decision you reached. But bluntly, why didn't the JCVI reach a decision mid-March and give its public statement at press conference then?
We didn't have the information that was required to make that decision.
Thank you. Professor, those are all my questions. Thank you very much.
Given the time, I'm going to try and reduce the amount of time left for the questions. I gave permission to the disabled people's organisations to ask a question about the definition of carer, and we can explain why you and Mr. Keith got in some confusion about what was different definition, because it's explained in the question. 30th December 2020, JCVI included main carers in cohort 6, but then the definition was narrowed on the 12th of February 2021 to those who are the sole or primary carer. And the question from the organisations is this: given many disabled people rely on more than one carer to have an effective and independent life, did the JCVI give any thought to the confusion that this narrow definition of carer might cause?
Just to clarify the situation, carers were included in the Green Book advice at the start of December. It was only also included as a footnote at the end of December because there was feedback that it was difficult to find the advice. And so we wanted to make it clear that the advice was already there, but that people needed to look in the Green Book for the definition. And the Green Book is indeed the place where one reaches all the definitions for the very many conditions. We don't list definitions within the clinical statements for obvious purposes. The definition that was in the Green Book and at the start of December and the end of December was the same definition that was used to identify carers for the influenza program. In February, I'm speaking here on behalf of UKHSA, who are the editors of the Green Book. It is not the JCVI. But Mary Ramsey, who gave witness a few days ago, I think she said this as well, that the clarification in February was not actually a clarification around the definition of carers. That was not the intended clarification. The clarification was to enable NHSE to identify who was being cared for. That was where the clarification was intended. So I think any misunderstanding regarding main, sole, or primary carer is just that. There's no intended narrowing of the definition of carer by those change in words.
Thank you. Just so that Ms. Beattie doesn't think I'm picking on her, I'm going to ask Mr. Wagner's question too. I gave permission for this question to be asked by the clinically vulnerable families. Do you agree that mRNA COVID-19 vaccine protection has been shown to wane after 5 to 6 months?
That is information we now know, yes.
Do you also agree that COVID-19 has not transitioned into a seasonal virus like influenza?
That's correct.
In which case, Mr. Wagner wanted to know, why did the JCVI not recommend more frequent vaccinations for all clinically vulnerable groups?
Clinically vulnerable groups, just trying to think where we are. So clinically vulnerable groups were offered vaccination as a primary course, and then every autumn, 21 and 22, 23 and 24. The phrase clinically extremely vulnerable obviously was disbanded after a while, and so it's difficult to separate out that from the later programs. They would come in under people who are clinically at risk. In spring 2022, JCVI, I think, was the first country in the world to suggest that we should have a spring booster campaign. And this was a precautionary position for those people in whom we thought their immunity might wane before the autumn program. No other country had done this, and at that point, we were not sure just how quickly immunity would wane. So we know some things now, but we didn't know all of them then. And so the spring booster campaign in 2022 was specifically directed at those who were most vulnerable and most likely to lose their immunity because of immune senescence, which is loss of immune protection because of age or a less good immune system. Hence, it was narrowed to those people aged 75 and above and people who have poor immune systems.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. That completes all the questions we have for you. I know that we're all extremely grateful for all the work that you did during the pandemic, and obviously your colleagues too. I know you'd want to share the credit with your colleagues, and we're indebted to you. And thank you very much for showing similar care in giving your evidence before the inquiry. Thank you so much for your help. I shall return at 2:10. All rise.